Now, the big problem with these AI code generation tools is that you can't bring them into a visual editor. However, we can use these code generation tools to generate custom coded components for WeWeb that we can then bring back into WeWeb's visual editor. So before we jump in, just know that this tutorial will cover things at a very high level. And the reason for this is that I want to showcase just, although we're building custom coded components, with the power of AI now, you don't actually need to know coding to build custom coded components, which is why in this case we'll be using Cursor. So if you are interested in learning more about the technicalities of each step as we go through this, I recommend you check out the video we did on using Claude Code to create custom coded components. There'll be a link to it in the description. And in that video, we go through each step manually. And because of that, I describe in a lot more detail what's actually happening behind the scenes at each step. However, as mentioned, we won't do that for this tutorial. Cursor will do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. So to get started, the first thing you want to do is download Cursor. It's pretty straightforward. Just type in on your browser of choice, download Cursor, click the first link, and then choose whatever operating system you have, download the installer, and then run the installer. Then once you have Cursor installed and you open it up, you'll be presented with a screen like this. Now from here, you can go through and manually set up projects and repositories, but for this example, as said, we'll be using Cursor, and we'll get Cursor to do a lot of the heavy lifting. So in this case, Cursor will set up everything for us. Now before Cursor can just go ahead and set things up for us, we need to give it a bit of context as to how to actually set up a project for building a custom component for WeWeb. Now in our developer documentation, there's this page development process, and in here it outlines exactly how to set up a project for building a custom component for WeWeb. So what I'm going to do is I'm simply just going to copy and paste this page up to this point. So up until it references how to actually then use the component in the WeWeb editor, I'm going to copy all of this. The reason I'm not copying anything beyond here is just because Cursor can't obviously control what happens inside of the WeWeb editor, and I don't want to give it this as context just because it might confuse it and it might go off and try to do things that it simply can't. So just for setting up the project, I'm for now simply just going to copy and paste this part. So in Cursor, I'm going to press this icon in the top right, and this will open up the chat with Cursor. And I'm just going to give it a prompt with a bit of context and then paste in that documentation. So I can say, let's set up a project for building a WeWeb custom coded component. So here are the docs to set up the project, and then just paste it beneath. Now, before we send off this prompt, there's two things that we need to specify to Cursor. The first thing we need to specify is whether we want our component to be an element or a section inside the editor. Now, if you aren't too sure what the difference is, then I recommend you just choose an element. And for the vast majority of use cases, an element is actually the type that you'll want. And the second thing we need to specify is the name of the component. So I will first specify that I want it to be an element, and I will then specify its name. For this example, we'll be building a flippable card, so I'll call it flippable card. And finally, before I send this prompt off to Cursor, I just need to make sure that I'm in the correct mode. So I can click this button in the bottom left, and I want to make sure that I'm in agent mode, because this way Cursor can take actions on my behalf, like creating repositories and creating files. So with that confirmed, I can simply send the prompt off to Cursor. So in real time, in the chat, Cursor will detail its thought process. We can also see it's created a to-do list in the chat, and one by one, it will go through that to-do list, and every action that it takes, such as running something in the terminal, it'll detail exactly what it's doing for that action. So that's now ran, and if we scroll back through this, at the end, Cursor always tends to give you a plain English summary of what it's done. So we can see here it's scaffolded a project using the template that we gave it from our developer documentation, installed the required dependencies, and it's now started the dev server. And what this essentially means is that because it started the dev server and this component is running on that development server, we can now access this component from inside of the WeWeb editor. So now inside of WeWeb, we can see this custom component. So what I'll first do is I just have a blank project here. And on this page, I'm going to add a section to the page. I am going to give it 100% width, and I'm going to give it 100 VH, just so it takes up the entire screen height. And then finally, I'm going to center everything. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because once we switch to dev mode of the editor, none of our changes get saved. And so just for visualizing the component easily, it's nice to have it centered. If we wanted to have it centered and we didn't do this prior to switching to dev mode, on page refresh, every single time we'd have to do this. So on page refresh, we'd have to drag a section onto the page and change its styling. So just to make life easier when we're testing, I'm setting this up beforehand. So with that done, I can press more at the top. I can click development and I can then click open dev editor. And we will then be brought to the dev editor. Now, just to reiterate the point, as it says in the top right, changes in the dev editor are not saved. So please be careful you don't accidentally go back onto a different page of your application and start making edits thinking they'll be saved, because they won't be. Any changes while you're in dev mode will not be saved. So with that said, we now have this dev tab in the top header. So we can click this and we can click add local element. And we can now configure our custom coded component so we can pull it into the editor. Now for the element select, I recommend you just choose custom. Essentially what these options allow you to do is to replace an existing element in your project with the custom coded component. This can be useful for certain nuanced testing use cases, but if this is your first time building a custom coded component, I recommend for simplicity, you just choose custom. You can then give it a name. And now for the port, you'll just want to double check what port Cursor actually ran the component on. So the default here is 8080, but if I open Cursor, I don't think it used that port. So if I just scroll back through what it did, here we can see it started the dev server on localhost 4040. So in order for this to work, I just need to change this to 4040 because Cursor ran this on that port. And so then I can press validate certificate. And I then need to authorize this. So essentially, the reason I have to authorize this is because right now we're running this component locally on our device. And because it's being ran locally, the browser just can't assume that it's safe to run. So in order to run this in the browser, we need to manually authorize it. And to do so, I can simply press proceed to localhost. And once you see this OK screen, you can just close the tab. And then press save. The page will then refresh, and once it does, you can again open the dev panel, and we now have our custom coded component. And this is much like the add panel in the sense I can simply just drag this onto the page and we have a custom coded component. Now the reason the custom coded component looks like this to start off with this I am a custom element text and this text color property that works as you would expect, is because this is the skeleton of a custom coded component that comes with the WeWeb package that we use to set everything up. And just to give you some context of how this looks behind the scenes, is in Cursor, we can see that it's set up this new directory in this math.us folder, which is just the base of my device. And then it created this flippable card directory inside of math.us. Now, I didn't specify a particular directory that it should have created this new directory inside of. So if you have somewhere that you would like this new file to be, you can specify it in that initial prompt. But because I didn't, it's just saved this new directory inside of the base directory of my device. So what I can do is I can press open project, and I'm already inside of my base directory. And if I sort this to be by date here, I can see we have that directory that it just created, the flippable card directory. So I can click this and then press open. And so I'll then be brought to that directory inside of Cursor. And this is the directory of the custom coded component. And as such, it contains all of the files of the custom coded component. Now again, zero coding knowledge is required to edit this custom coded component because we'll be using Cursor, but for context, it can help to just have a very high level understanding of what the contents of the core files are. And for custom coded components, there's two core files. The first is this element file. Here basically sits everything that will appear in the canvas of the editor when you're using this custom coded component. So for example, you can see here we have this text element, and the text defined for it is I am a custom element, which is why we see this I am a custom element text inside of the custom coded component in the editor. And we'll also see the styling that controls this element. So we can see right now it has a font size of 18 pixels, but if I just move this to the side so you can see in real time how this would update, is if I was to change this to 24 pixels and then save my changes, you'll see when I do this in real time, the font size of what is on the canvas will update. So if I save this, you can see the font size increased. So inside this element file, we define exactly what should be on the page, how it should look, and here, this is a simple custom coded component, so there isn't much logic, but any particular logic the component has will also appear in this element file. And the second core file is the config file. And so inside of this config file, the main use case for it is we can define the properties available for the component. And for now, I won't add a new property, but just to give you some context of how this works is, for example, I could change the default value. So right now we have this hex code for the default value. And let's say I want it to be all black. So I could set this to be an all black hex code, and I could then save my changes. And whenever you make an edit to the config file, the page will refresh because the component has to be reloaded with its new properties. And once it has reloaded, if I drag that component onto the page, because the new default for the text color was black, as we can see, by default, the text is black. And the text color property reflects that. So at a high level, the config is used to define exactly what should appear in the right panel whenever you have the component selected. So primarily the properties that are available. And the element file defines exactly how the custom coded component should look and how it should function at its core. Now, before we jump into prompting Cursor to build whatever custom coded component we like, there's one last thing we need to do, and that's give Cursor some kind of knowledge of how exactly it needs to build WeWeb custom coded components. And the way we do that in Cursor is via rules. So again, in our developer documentation, there's this page called Using Claude Code, and there'll soon be one called Using Cursor once this video is released. But for now, the same principles apply, so I'm going to copy something from this page. And what I'm going to copy is as a quick link here to access the Claude MD file. So I'll click this, and once I do, inside of this dropdown, we have access to this Claude MD file. Now, although this is called the Claude MD file, we can still perfectly use it for our use case, because at the end of the day, all we need when we're using AI to build custom coded components, in this case Cursor, is we need to essentially give it some kind of knowledge base / system prompt of how to exactly build custom coded components for WeWeb. And that is exactly what this document details. So I can simply copy it here. I can open up Cursor, and I'm going to click this cog in the top right corner. I'm going to click Rules, Memories, and Commands, and I'm going to add a project rule. First, we need to give it a name, so I'll call it WeWeb Component Guidelines. Once done, I can press Enter, and I'm then brought to the page where I can define what should be inside of this rule set. So beneath this section, I can simply just paste in whatever the rule should be. So in this case, I'm just pasting in that Claude MD file. And so it doesn't cause any potential confusion, I'm just going to delete this part at the start that mentions Claude MD. I don't think it would cause any confusion, but just in case, I'll delete it, and I can leave everything as is. And then lastly, at the top here, we have this selector that defines when Cursor should use this rule set. And by default, it's set to always apply, meaning every single prompt we make to Cursor, this rule set will be passed into Cursor. And for our use case, this is exactly what we want. I want this component rule set to be passed in with all my prompts because we're building a custom coded component, and I want Cursor to understand the nuances that go into that process. So I'll confirm always apply, and once done, I will save my changes. Now, with that out of the way, we can prompt Cursor to actually start building. And so, as I mentioned at the start, for this use case, I'm going to be building a flippable card, and I want it to look like this. So what I can do is I will take a screenshot of the card, like so. I will open up Cursor, and in the chat, I will paste in that image. And now I can just give a prompt that details exactly what I want Cursor to build. So I can say, I want this custom coded component to be a flippable card, and I want it to look like the one in the image attached. And now we could define things specific to WeWeb custom coded components. So for example, we could ask it for specific properties that we want available to us, so we can control this component from inside of the editor. Or we could ask it for other things related to components, like we could ask it to expose certain variables, emit triggers when certain events happen, or expose certain component actions so we can programmatically control the component from anywhere on the page. In this case, I'm just going to ask it for some properties, and the properties I want are to control the images on both sides of the card and the text on both sides of the card. So I can say make sure there are properties to control the image and text on both sides of the card. And then I can simply send this off. So that is now done, and Cursor will have given us a summary of basically all of the actions that it's taken. So you can see here it changed the config, and in the config it added different properties that we can control. And then in the element file, it's added the core UI and the functionality of the component. And if we switch to the config file, we can see all of this. So in Cursor, whenever a change has been made, if something has been removed in the change, it'll be marked in red, so it no longer exists. And if it's in green, this means it's just been added. And in the coding world, this is called diffs, so basically differences. And whenever Cursor does make a change, at a granular level, you can accept and reject each change. So for example, if I scroll to the bottom of this new addition, here you can see we can undo or keep this. So at a granular level, we can control whether or not we want to keep or undo each section of changes that it's made. For now, I'm just going to keep all. And we can see here, it's completely updated to the config file and now included different properties like the front title, the front description, the front image, etc. And if we check out the element file, again, it's made a bunch of changes. I will keep all of these, and we won't go through the ins and outs of this code, but at a base level, it's created the HTML of a card. So for example, we can see there's a title element, a description element, and then an image element. And then beneath this, there's a bunch of functionality that it's added. And then at the bottom, there's classes that it's added to control the styling. So with this now done, we can actually use this inside of WeWeb. Now you'll notice that we still have this original custom coded component with the I am a custom element text, and nothing is updated in accordance with the changes that were just made. And the reason for this is that we aren't actually running this component locally. We're still running this old one. So if you remember at the start, Cursor set up the directory for us, and then it ran the component locally. However, after that, I manually opened the project in Cursor, and because I did that, I'd basically opened a brand new instance of the component, and I never ran this instance locally. So we need to run this one locally now. So if you ever need to clear what you're running locally and run something else, you can open the dev panel and click clear elements and then confirm it. Then once that is cleared, you can open up Cursor again. And from here, you could ask Cursor to run it locally, but honestly, for this, it's actually way easier to just type the command yourself in the terminal. So you can click this button in the bottom right to open the terminal, and all you need to type in is npm space run space serve. And this will basically run the component locally as Cursor did for us at the start. So we can press enter. This will then serve the component to us locally. So we can now again open the dev panel and click add local element. We can choose custom and again give it a name. We've already connected this, so we don't need to reauthorize it again. And I'm going to leave the port as 8080 because when we ran npm run serve, we didn't specify a port. When Cursor ran this for us at the start, it specified 4040, which is why when we initially did this, we had to put in 4040. But when we do npm run serve and we don't specify a port, it defaults to 8080. So I'll leave it as 8080. Then I can press save. The page will reload, and once it does, I can drag the component onto the page. And here we can see we have this flippable card. Now, some of the functionality I will need to adjust because we can see right now it's flipping all over the place because I guess by default, the cursor has set it up to flip on hover, but I can click onto the flippable card and I'm just going to change some of its styling so we can work with it a bit better. So I will give this a height of 300 and then a width of 300. And if I go into the settings, we can see it's set to flip on hover by default. So I'm just going to turn this off so we can work with it a bit better for now. And this looks a bit rough so far because we haven't adjusted any of the properties, but let's do that now and make sure the properties work. So if I adjust this, I can see in real time, this changes in accordance with what I'm typing. I'm not keen on the position, but we can ask Cursor to update this afterwards. And if I test the description, I can see that is also updating correctly. And if I just grab a random image address online and then test to make sure the image property is working, cool, we can see that is indeed working, but I can no longer see the title text. So that will be an issue that I want Cursor to fix. And along with that, I can see the card background property also isn't working as expected. So this will be another thing I ask Cursor to fix. And now things are a bit better visualized. If I just check the flipping, so I'll put flip on hover back to on, I can see the flipping is working correctly. And the title of this is additional details or copy. And I can see that is the property. So that's working as expected. So there's a few things we want to fix. So back in Cursor now, what I want to fix is I want the title to be at the very top of the card, and I want the card background property to work. So I can ask Cursor to fix these. And then send this off. So now again, if we check out the component, we can see the card background does indeed now reflect whatever we have it set to, which is great. And we can see the title text. And just to make sure, that title color text property does work as expected. And the one other thing I forgot to check is if the flip on click works. So if I put this into preview, this does not work. So the last thing I want Cursor to update is to make sure the flip on click works. So it's now made changes. I will again keep all. If we now try and click on the card, we can see, okay, cool. The flip on click now works as expected. And of course, because this is a custom coded component, we have all the niceties that come with custom coded components, so we can use it visually inside of the editor. So we of course have all of the properties that we can control on the right-hand side. But in this case, the AI automatically set up some variables for us. So there's 3 of these right now, just because we're in testing. However, in production, there would only be 1 shown. And so whenever we flip this, we can see this changes as expected. So we could set up logic around this inside of the editor. And likewise, if we create a workflow and check out the events, we can see there's multiple triggers that are available. So for example, let's say on flip change, we could create logic, and just to showcase what would be available in this event is I will log something, and we could log the data that gets passed in the event. So whatever the value of flipped now is. So now when we test this out, if I open up the logs, when we flip this, we can see it's logging whatever the value of flip now is. So this custom coded component now gives us various ways we can work with it visually inside of the editor. So the final piece is now using this in our production applications. Now to do so, you'll want to go into the settings of your workspace, and in the settings, you'll want to connect GitHub. Now, I already have GitHub connected. However, if you don't have GitHub connected, you just need to go through the straightforward process of connecting your GitHub from here. And then once you have GitHub connected, we need to upload this component to our GitHub so we can import it into our workspace so we can use it in our live applications. Now, once we have GitHub connected, we need to create a repository in our GitHub that we can upload the component to. So to do so, you can simply just go to GitHub, and in GitHub, beside repositories, you can press this new button and we can now create the repository. So I will give it an appropriate name. You can choose whether or not you want the repository to be public or private, and then you can simply create the repository. From here, you'll be given this link. So you can copy this link. And so now back in Cursor, we can simply just put in a prompt to push our code to this repository. And as a note at this stage, if your GitHub account isn't already connected to your device, then you'll likely be prompted to authenticate at this step. So it's done, but at the bottom here, it said in progress, add GitHub remote and push main branch. It's been blocked by authentication. And so in my case, I am yet to connect GitHub to my device. And so I can ask Cursor to help me with this process. So it's given us 3 options, and the easiest one is to just use the GitHub CLI, so we can authenticate directly with GitHub. So what I'll do is I'll follow the steps it gave me for option C. So the first thing I need to do is run this in my terminal. So I will just copy this, open the terminal using this button in the bottom right. I'm going to clear this, and I'm then going to paste in what it gave me, press enter. I'll choose HTTPS. I will type in a capital Y to say yes and press enter. And then I will copy this one-time code. And then it says I can press enter to open this device. So I can press enter, continue with my account, and then just paste in that code it gave me and press continue. And then I will authorize access. And finally, I have multi-factor authentication set up on my GitHub account. So if you have the same, you just need to go onto your device and confirm it with your multi-factor authentication code. Once that's done, you will see a screen confirming you're all set, so you can then close the window. And so now that I'm authenticated, I'm just going to take the exact same prompt I gave at the start about committing and pushing it, open a new chat, and then just give it the same prompt. And now that we're authenticated with GitHub, it will be able to push to GitHub. And so now that that is done, if I go back onto the GitHub page and I refresh, we can see this repository has now been populated with the code of our custom coded component. And what this now means is that back on the WeWeb dashboard, in my workspace, I can go to the coded components tab and I can now press import element. I can give the component a name. I will choose the source, choose the repository, which was this repository. I can choose the branch right now that only is main, and I can then press create. Then this component will be installed and built. Then once it's uploaded, we can choose which version to set. Now, since we've only just created this, there only is one version, but in the future, when we make changes and there's multiple versions, we can control which version is the active version from here. So I will set this to be active and then press the confirmation at the bottom. And that is now set to be active and uploaded to our workspace. And so what this now means is that I could go into a live version of my project. So here you can see we had the dev version, but I will now close this and go into the live version. And so now on the live version, I'm just going to refresh the page. I will open the add panel, go to the coded components tab. And here we can see we have this new WeWeb flippable card component. So if I now drag this onto the page, I can see it is indeed that component that we just created. So we could give it some styling, change the properties to whatever we like, and this will then work as expected. So we can now use this in our live projects. So that's how you can create custom coded components using Cursor. In the description, there'll be a link to the developer documentation where once this video goes live, we will have a dedicated page on building custom coded components using Cursor, and it will essentially be a written version of this video. So you can go to that if you would like a written version of this tutorial that you can refer back to, or if you would like a quick way to access that knowledge prompt that I gave into Cursor about how to build custom coded components for WeWeb. Now the flippable card example we just built is obviously a very basic example, but hopefully it gives you an idea of how powerful this can be. One, because of the external functionality you can bring into WeWeb, but two, how you can set up things around the component that let you work with it in a visual way inside of the editor. By being able to define exactly what properties you want for the component, what variables it should expose, what triggers are available for its workflows, different things of that nature, so you don't have to dive into the code. You can create it, set it once, and then create further logic around it in a visual way. One last thing that I think is noteworthy is that every single element we have available in the add panel behind the scenes is just a custom coded component that the WeWeb team have created. And all of these are open sourced and available on our GitHub repository. There'll be a link to the repository in the description. And the reason I say this is because if you wanted to, you could fork one of these repositories and take it into Cursor and manually add functionality that isn't usually available. Or if you're building something very complex, it helps to have some of our complex components that you can give into Cursor as context so it knows how to set up certain things. So for example, if you were building some kind of complex calendar component, you might want to take our current calendar component from our repo and pass it into Cursor as you're building so it has some context as to how to build some parts of the complex functionality that come with WeWeb components. In that specific case, calendars. If you do build any cool custom coded components, please do let us know about them. We're always curious to see what the community builds with these kinds of things. So feel free to share it with us on any of our socials or post it on the community forum. Until next time, happy building.